the West lifted its range restrictions, and with that, the war took a historic turn. Backed by newly authorized long-range weapons, Ukraine carried the fight deep into the heart of Russia. Refineries, fuel depots, and power grids were struck by Ukrainian drones and missiles, hitting the energy infrastructure that sustains the Kremlin. Meanwhile, Moscow responded with its familiar rhetoric about red lines, but without real strategic retaliation. The conflict had entered a new phase, one no longer confined to Donbass or Crimea, but unfolding inside Russian territory itself, with unpredictable consequences. The line that was crossed. November 2024 marked a decisive turning point. Washington lifted the ban that had prevented Ukraine from using U.S. weapons on Russian soil, a move that quickly evolved from limited to irreversible. By May 27, 2025, Europe and the United States removed the remaining range restrictions, allowing Kyiv to employ Western precision systems beyond the front lines. For Moscow, it was the moment the war unmistakably spilled across Ukraine's borders. On October 1, 2025, NATO took another step, sharing satellite and signals intelligence to identify Russian energy targets. Refineries, fuel depots, and power plants became the new invisible battlefield. Supported by Western intelligence, Ukrainian strikes began to degrade the infrastructure feeding both Russia's economy and its war machine. By October 9th, Kyiv claimed a historic success. Russian gasoline output had fallen by roughly 20%. Moscow, wary of escalation with NATO, confined its response to warnings and rhetoric. The war's logic had changed, no longer just about defending Ukraine, but about striking at Russia's logistical heart. The geopolitical board had been redrawn. How far can Ukraine go before provoking a larger Russian response? And how sustainable are these deep strike operations without risking direct confrontation with NATO? What changed on the battlefield? In recent weeks, the conflict has morphed into a war over energy. Ukraine has intensified drone and missile attacks, both domestically produced and Western supplied, on Russian refineries, depots, and platforms. According to President Zelensky, the impact has been severe, up to a 20% reduction in Russian gasoline output and availability. These strikes aim to undermine Russia's economy from within, disrupt its military logistics, and raise the cost of war for the Kremlin. Moscow's reply was swift. Russia doubled down on attacks against Ukraine's gas and heating networks, just as winter approached. Cities across Ukraine now face rolling blackouts and the growing threat of prolonged outages. Kyiv fears that Russia's energy offensive seeks to break civilian morale and trigger new waves of displacement during the coldest months. The battlefield is now measured not in kilometers gained, but in megawatts destroyed and fuel reserves exhausted. In this war of energy and endurance, each side targets the other's Achilles heel. While Russia seeks to freeze Ukraine, Kyiv aims to set fire to Russia's economic engine. Winter will be the next great battle. How much weight do the Kremlin's threats still carry? Are Moscow's red lines genuine warnings, or political instruments designed to slow Western support? Moscow's red lines. After Ukrainian strikes inside Russia, Moscow's nuclear ambiguity once again dominated the geopolitical stage. Since the invasion began, the Kremlin has wielded the idea of the nuclear threshold as deterrence. Each time the West escalates, sending tanks, aircraft, or long-range missiles, Moscow warns of catastrophic consequences. Yet those red lines keep shifting, revealing a psychological tactic rather than a military one, maintaining fear of escalation to stall Western aid. The recent debate over sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine revived that playbook. Russia's foreign ministry warned such a move would irreparably damage relations with the United States and cross a direct red line. But in practice, Moscow has repeatedly avoided proportionate retaliation, eroding its credibility. This calculated ambiguity seeks to sow doubt, to make every Western decision feel like the trigger of a greater war. Yet after nearly 3 years of conflict, many in the West see these threats as part of Moscow's routine script. The Kremlin's red lines are no longer fixed borders, but a narrative it adjusts to suit its needs. The question that remains: if confronted with a new escalation or a symbolic blow to its power, will Russia finally turn words into action? Europe aligns. As Washington redefined its red lines, another race began across the Atlantic: Europe's race to build its own long-range power. In 2025, London and Berlin announced a joint development of a precision missile with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers, the first deep strike project designed entirely in Europe. Its deployment is still years away, not expected before the early 2030s, but the decision itself marks a turning point in European defense thinking. France, meanwhile, renewed its military partnership with the United Kingdom under the Lancaster House 2.0 treaty, restarting production of the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles, the same weapons already shaping Ukraine's skies today. At the same time, the European Union launched the Readiness 2030 plan to strengthen the continent's defense industry and reduce reliance on the United States. The next 18 months will be crucial. Europe aims to double missile production and position a credible arsenal of long-range weapons across its own territory. Yet unity has limits. Paris and Berlin remain at odds over the next-generation fighter jet, and political debates reveal a deeper question. What happens when Europe's offensive power is no longer theoretical, but real? For the first time in decades, the old continent is no longer a supporting player. It is preparing to project power on its own. Stalled diplomacy. By mid-2025, diplomacy was back in the headlines, but only as theater. In May, Istanbul once again hosted direct talks between Russian and Ukrainian envoys, with Turkish mediators framing the effort as a new opening. There were polite gestures, discussions about prisoner exchanges and humanitarian corridors, yet no trace of a ceasefire. As the war lines hardened, Moscow began to speak of readiness for dialogue. In the autumn, the Kremlin announced it was open to talks without preconditions, but the offer came with the same demands, first set out in 2022: recognition of occupied regions and a neutral Ukraine. To Kyiv, it was a familiar script, a delaying tactic meant to buy time while Russia repaired its supply lines after a wave of Ukrainian strikes inside Russian territory. Western diplomats quietly agreed. The negotiating tables now exist to fill the silence, not to end the war. Turkey and the United Nations keep their channels alive, if only to avoid admitting failure. The year ends with statements, not solutions, and a growing sense that the war of words has become as endless as the one fought on the ground. When diplomacy stalls, strategy turns to pressure, and the battlefield shifts to energy. Energy as a battlefield. Energy infrastructure has become a deliberate target, not by accident, but by strategy. Striking refineries, fuel depots, and pipelines inflicts direct economic pain, disrupts military logistics, and forces an opponent to divert scarce resources to protect and replace critical capacity. For Ukraine, hitting Russian oil and fuel nodes degrades Moscow's ability to move and fuel heavy formations and raises the cost of sustaining long campaigns. Kyiv argues these strikes are a form of long-range sanctions, a way to choke the war machine without a full ground breakthrough. Recent Ukrainian strikes have, Kyiv says, reduced Russian gasoline supplies by roughly a fifth, a figure that, if sustained, carries immediate domestic and military consequences for Russia. At the same time, Moscow has not been passive. Russian counterstrikes have targeted Ukrainian gas infrastructure, seeking to squeeze Kyiv's energy supply and create leverage in the winter months. The result is mutual vulnerability. Each side uses energy to pressure the other and to shape political will at home. The operational picture matters. Destroying a refinery is technically different from denying a single depot. Refineries take months to repair and require specialized parts. Destroying storage and logistics nodes can be done faster, but yields more localized effects. That is why Kyiv has pressed for Western long-range strike systems, including requests to acquire Tomahawk-class missiles, to sustain pressure on distant, hardened targets deep inside Russia. Reports in October 2025 show Kyiv pressing U.S. officials for exactly those capabilities. When pipelines and refineries become targets, the battlefield expands into markets, ports, and living rooms, and energy becomes a weapon as much as a resource. Risks of escalation and how they are managed. Every step that expands Ukraine's reach risks crossing another invisible line. For Western governments, the challenge in 2025 is not only how to help Kyiv win, but how to do it without triggering direct confrontation with Moscow. Washington, London, and Brussels have adopted what strategists call managed ambiguity, never defining precisely what would constitute too far, but signaling enough strength to deter Russia from widening the war. Each new authorization, from missile deliveries to intelligence sharing, is accompanied by carefully worded statements supporting Ukraine's self-defense, never attacking Russia. Behind closed doors, defense officials describe a rhythm of calibrated incrementalism. Small moves, measured pauses, constant assessment of Moscow's reaction before the next step. Academic analyses from the IISS and CSIS call this the ladder of escalation management, a way to climb without falling. So far, it has worked. The Kremlin issues threats, but stops short of actions that would expand the conflict beyond Ukraine. Still, the risk is ever present. A missile gone off course, a strike too close to the border, a decision misread in the fog of war. For policymakers, this is the tightrope of modern warfare: to support a partner at war without becoming a belligerent. And as the front extends into Russia itself, the margin for error narrows with every strike. When deterrence turns into routine, the question is no longer if the war can escalate, but when the world will notice it already has. As winter approaches, the war enters a new and dangerous phase. In early October 2025, Russian cruise missile waves struck Ukraine's underground gas storage network, cutting national reserve capacity by nearly 45%, a deliberate blow to energy security and civilian resilience. For Kyiv, the timing is devastating. Heating season begins just as pressure on fuel imports and electricity grids reaches its peak. The question now is not only how Ukraine will fight, but how it will endure. Analysts see three short-term paths ahead. Scenario A: sustained pressure. Ukraine keeps striking Russian oil facilities while Western aid ramps up emergency generators and modular gas storage. The front stabilizes. Energy becomes the true battleground of endurance. Scenario B: Russian escalation. Moscow expands its campaign against power and transit lines, aiming to freeze cities into submission. Europe faces new spikes in gas prices and another refugee wave seeking warmth and light. Scenario C: negotiation window. If economic pain deepens on both sides, pressure from partners, especially Turkey and the EU, could reopen talks early 2026, perhaps tied to energy guarantees rather than territorial compromise. Each path carries risks of miscalculation. A cold winter, a single blackout, or a stray missile could shift public opinion faster than any battlefield victory. In wars of attrition, survival itself becomes strategy, and the next 6 months may decide who still has the power and the energy to keep fighting. The war in Ukraine no longer moves only on the map. It moves through economies, alliances, and the quiet choices of millions trying to endure. Each decision, each strike, each silence reshapes the balance of a world still learning how fragile peace can be. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. What do you believe will define the next chapter? Diplomacy, deterrence, or endurance? Let's keep the conversation alive, because understanding the world is the first step to changing it. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Leave your reflections below, subscribe to the Geography channel for more geopolitical explorations, and share this video to expand the discussion. See you next time in our ongoing journey through history, power, and place.